Hello, Charles Spencer.
Hello,
I'm
Gina.
very delighted to have you on our Therapy Works podcast. I'm actually a bit nervous because I haven't had a conversation or in a way, a session like this before. But for those of you, those listening who don't know, you're an author, you're a journalist, you're a broadcaster, a podcaster, a British peer, and you're the younger brother of the late Diana, Princess of Wales.
Correct.
Do you want to add to that list?
Well, I think that's enough, isn't it? Thank you.
My memory is that you and I met through your sisters, through Diana and then through Sarah and Jane after she died.
Yes.
But we've sat next to each other, but I haven't known you well. So this is like I haven't ever really met you.
Absolutely right, and right to establish that, yes.
And what I always ask my guests on this podcast is there a particular challenge that you are facing or have faced?
Well, right now, yes, it's the very, well, for me, the unique challenge of bearing my soul to the world. So I lived with a secret for a very long time that some people knew about because they had a similar one. But I went to a particularly abusive boarding school between the ages of 8 and 13. It's an endless emotional and physical abuse. But the thing I hadn't really shared before was also sexual abuse. But to be honest, it's extraordinary to open up about this. And today's the first day, really, that it's been public knowledge. Because I now realise that there were other people suffering similarly who haven't had a voice or chosen to keep it secret. And they seem to be sort of relieved. So I have that particular challenge, but I seem to have some allies, which is very nice.
And there is something particularly contaminating and kind of wounding of your soul when you hold a secret that feels shameful, like there's something wrong with you, because that's what you feel as a child when you're physically, psychologically and sexually abused. And yet it's impossible to kind of stand back and look at that as an adult without somehow feeling that there's something wrong with you, because that's the terrible thing about abuse, is that when you keep it secret, it does sow into your kind of being this feeling of wrongness.
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because there is a phrase I write in the book where I say, you know, this institution 50 years ago really sowed demons into the lining of our souls. It made us flawed human beings afterwards. But as you rightly say, sort of floundering under the misunderstanding that somehow we were responsible. It's been fascinating to me to realize how deeply buried all this pain has been. I've heard from, well, I say a boy, he's 60-something now, but he was at the school with me, and he wrote to me last week to say thank you. And, you know, he went to university with the girl who then became his wife, and he said this is the first time he's ever spoken to her about it, and they've just sat there crying for an hour. And so,
God, it's so heartbreaking.
It is. And then I had a great contemporary, in fact, he's one of the lead characters in the book with me. Everyone's got a false name in my book, but he's called William Purefoy in the book. And he was begging me not to write it because it's too painful for him, and he didn't want it all opened up. And then he wrote last night, was so grateful, and he's still got scars on his buttocks from beatings in 1977, so goodness knows what scars he's got on his soul as well.
Do you want to give us some of the kind of details? I mean, for me, it was one of the most painful books I've ever read, and I've read a lot of painful books. It was, you write beautifully, and the sort of searing trauma memories are so clear. I felt like I was in that truly horrendous school, Madewell, with you. But do you want to tell us some of the incidents that happened that particularly stand out, so people have an idea of what you're talking about? This isn't just a sort of slap on the bottom with a slipper.
No. Well, luckily I have done decades of therapy. I have engaged in decades of therapy, so I sort of can tap into this from the adult perspective. But I suppose the most chilling thing about arriving at a school like that when you're 7 or 8 was the very quick realization that there was no one there to help you.
No saviours.
There were no saviours at all. I know this may sound genderist, but there wasn't a single warm female human in the staff. And so you're left with some pretty grisly men. I call the book A Very Private School because that's very relevant.
Very clever title.
So the headmaster was definitely a sadist paedophile. And he had ultimate power. He saw to it that the governors had no ever. We never saw a governor come into the school. Parents weren't allowed inside the school buildings. And he closed it down. And he was a terrifying, pulsing menace through my 5 years there. I never saw him smile unless it was to the parents when they were collecting the boys or whatever. The whole school.
You were 8. I mean, I just.
Mm-hmm. I think the whole school was predicated on the demand he had to have at least 6 of us 70-odd boys delivered to him for beating on a nightly basis when he would be aroused, physically aroused. And then private, the most painful thing was learning about friends of mine who I adored. You know, we were like brothers, and I didn't know they were being secretly molested in the night, etc. And then a sort of almost a Dickensian cast of baddies.
The henchmen.
Yeah. There was one who was he's hiding in plain sight, but because he was he's Honourable Henry Maud, people thought he must be okay. I think the parents thought, well, he's all right, he's one of us. But he was terrifying. I mean, he beat a boy unconscious with a window pole, and he almost killed a boy in the swimming pool. Yeah. And, I mean, really extraordinary.
I mean, this is violence that is just beyond comprehension, isn't it?
Yes.
With people who are meant to be in loco parentis.
Yes, that was the most extraordinary thing. I think the penny dropped for me in my early 40s when I went to do a thing called the Hoffman process, which is really looking at your childhood, I think, and letting go of your childhood. And I mentioned my years at Madewell as a sort of sideshow, actually, to the therapist who was in charge of me. And he got me talking about it. And then he asked me to say one thing that I'd never told anyone before. And I told him I'd been sexually abused as a child. And then we got into the whole subject of Madewell. And I suppose he then gave me the devastating news that the headmaster was my surrogate father.
Oh, Charles. And abuse is at its worst when it's with people who you're meant to be able to trust.
Yes, I agree with that, yeah.
And as you're speaking, I'm so aware that what you call as fen traps of trauma, that trauma has no sense of time.
No.
You're 59, and
Yeah.
in that moment,
Yes.
you were 8 years old, in the constant threat from a monster.
Yes. I suppose we all had to find a way through it. Mine was to become very angry, actually. Because I knew, although I was 8 and 9, 10, 11, 12, and I didn't know what was wrong, I knew something was really, really wrong. When I was being sexually abused for a year, at the age
Which is a sexual trauma, because an 11-year-old, it completely blows you can't tolerate that kind of sexual excitement at that age.
No, there's a reason why it's illegal. And it's extraordinary to me that, you know, I'm sure this is, I haven't really spoken to many people, people who are abused as children, to be honest. But certainly for me, it was so confusing because it was so, well, it was, I couldn't put a thread through it. I didn't know what it was. And yet it was thrilling and dark and mysterious. And I think I instinctively knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how wrong. And I didn't know sexual abuse existed, obviously. I was so young. The worst part of this, well, the most jolting part of writing this book, and it's been hell to write, really, was the most extraordinary incident, which was right at the end when I decided to do something completely different. I just sent the manuscript in. And at my family's home, the curator was moving some books, and I thought I'd go and join and do something completely different. And on a high shelf, I pulled out a tiny book, and it was my diary from 1976. And the abuser had written a message inside it to me. And I nearly fell over. The fact that I'd literally sent the book in an hour earlier.
My God.
And I was rocked on my feet by this female writing, because I was abused by a female member of staff. And I hated.
She was called Please, which is, there's
Yeah.
something in that which is particularly repellent.
Yes, all the female members of staff had to be referred to as please. It was meant to instill good manners into us. And this woman who had been abusing me wrote in my diary, me, M-E, which I hate because it's possessive, it's knowing, and it's hiding. You know, it's almost like me, therefore you're mine. Me, I don't even need to say who I am because I'm so powerful in your life. And me, because I know I'm a paedophile, I'm not going to put my name down. But then her address and telephone number. For some reason, this adult wanted to stay in touch with an 11-year-old boy. It's interesting, one of the messages I got last night was from a friend of mine, and he said he'd always been aware, you know, he was 11 as well, he was aware of the focus she had on me, and he said he was jealous of it at the time, which just shows how we were all just...
Desperate for affection,
Yeah.
desperate for, you know, female warmth.
And also how unknowing we were. You know, he was jealous of me being abused.
Because it was attention.
Yes, probably. In a sort of tundra of a
threat.
A
You
emotional
only
place.
lived under threat. So
Yeah.
someone who was warm.
She was very clever because
She groomed you.
totally groomed me. She seemed to giggle at the monstrousness and the absurdities of the other members of staff with me.
So she was like on your side.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it just progressed, really. And it was devastating. Do you know, she was so cunning. She had 3 or 4 of us who she was abusing. And she used to sort of peel us off from the rest of the school and take us into a room at the top of the school called the music room, where no other members of staff ever went. And we'd play our pop records or whatever. And then you could tell when she'd suddenly decided one of us was out of favour, she'd literally turn her back on that one. And that meant none of us could talk to that person. He was ostracised until she turned on the beam of her affection again. And that was a devastating feeling. And then at the same time...
Total psychopath.
Yeah, well, I don't know, you would know.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, she manufactured, I believe, this crisis that she was going to have to leave earlier than planned because she went on to serve in the armed forces. And it's a strange school on many levels, but one of the strangest things is we all had sheath knives on our hips. It was just a very macho, weird culture.
The whole danger of that we're not even going to touch on because it's sort of small in comparison.
But what happened was I was so agonized that she was going to leave early that I started cutting myself. I sort of did a deal with God that if I hurt myself enough, he would let her stay. And of course, I look back on that now with incredulity. I was terrified that this paedophile was going to leave me.
As you were speaking, and as when I read it in your book, I could really feel this both physical kind of nausea, but also your total vulnerability. Like you had no protection. You were longing for safety, for trust. And all of us as human beings will go for anything. For, you know, if you put people together, monkeys together, they will go for a hug more than food. We need affection, we need love more than we need food in order to survive. And so when you talk about how she sort of psychotically manipulated you, adding other layers of torture on top to kind of keep you on this high alert, just is so, it's sort of unfathomable.
There was no shadow of a sort of maternal, feminine care in the school. So when she presented this, it was irresistible. And the main backdrop to her was this incredibly unpleasant matron, a real old battle axe who
was cruel,
very cruel lady. So and then the headmaster's wife was a ghost-like presence in the background, and so you had this young, charming seductress, and then this horrifying woman in the background. And I remember when I was very young, I remember the day, actually. It's the 20th of May, 1973. It was my 9th birthday. And because it was a Sunday, we had an extra hour's lie-in. And I was wide awake on time, so I had an hour to think about the extraordinary feeling of it being my birthday and not being allowed to see my family at all. And then I had this realization. I had a rather disconnected relationship with my mother because she had left home when I was very young. And I remember thinking this thought. I thought, well, my mother found it hard enough to care for me when I was 8, but now I was entering this mighty age of 9. How could she possibly? Because I could no longer be sweet. That was the word she used to say about me, as I was sweet. And I remember crying then. You know, it's sort of one of those memories. And then after that, I started to make myself sick on purpose as a sort of plea for attention from this horrible matron, really, because she was the only woman there. And I'd present this chamber pot from under my bed with a thin drool of vomit in it every morning, and she'd just basically tell me to stop wasting her time and get lost, really. So the fact that there was literally no one paying attention for what we would consider normal pastoral care, there was literally not a shred of it. The perverted female member of staff had a clear run, really.
And in a way, when you bring in your mum, you were already vulnerable. You know, the fault line of her leaving you at 2, and that you weren't even told the truth then.
No.
You were told she was going to come back. So the first time you were given communication was a lie. And as you said, Madewell was a lie. There was no trust. And what I kind of understood about your mum was that she was fun and effervescent,
yes,
and, you know, good at kind of being out there. But that image of you being left at the train station where you're kind of dreading feeling sick, going back to school, and she's like marching back to a jolly lunch or dinner. And that the one time she was going to come to the carol service, she missed your solo because she was late. You know, I'm sure she is who she is for all sorts of reasons, but it is a very profound neglect. And she didn't give, all of us as human beings are given a template of love. It's called secure or insecure attachment. And secure attachment is that we have predictable, reliable, secure affection, that we don't have to perform for it, we don't have to do a jig, you don't have to fear that you're going to lose your sweetness. And insecure is avoidant, disorganized, and ambivalent. And that's when you don't innately feel that I'm worthy of love because I'm not given it. Because I felt with your dad on the other side, there was this paradox of his sort of internal bankrupt loneliness, the two of you eating in separate rooms in this big house, and the way he kind of transmitted sadness. But he, in his own way, was no more able to give you affection. I mean, he could give you a hug and he was warm, but he was not paying attention. He didn't see you, notice you. But set against this incredible privilege, the emptiness, the bankruptcy of it, you know, your titles, all trip, the beautiful furniture, the history, there's something particularly kind of disturbing, I find, about that.
Yes, you know, one of the things I was worried about writing the book was that it would be seen by people who hadn't read it as a whinge by a very, very privileged man. But I see this as, yeah, as you touched upon, the individuals as my parents. I think my mother leaving home, you know, she fell in love with someone, these things happen. But it was all done so badly. I think part of that wasn't necessarily my parents' fault. I think divorce among the upper classes in the mid to late 60s was still so anathema that nobody really knew how to do it. Certainly they did it appallingly. I don't remember them.
I remember the thing in my childhood is what you don't see doesn't hurt you. You know, kind of don't
Yes.
Don't say anything, don't ask for anything.
Yeah. I think particularly the relationship with fathers in my sort of period of childhood was very remote, and I felt grateful. My father did. I have no doubt my father loved us enormously. He was actually a very sweet man. But I do feel that after my mother left, he was never going to see a therapist. He was never going to get help. And I think he limped along really for the rest of his life as an undiagnosed depressive. And it would have been against his culture to have, or his knowledge actually, to be fair, to have sought help. But of course, the impact of somebody else's mental illness is going to be felt by everyone, especially children in a one-parent house.
And then with a very difficult stepmother.
Yeah, so she comes along late in this piece when I was 12 or so. I mean, that's a very interesting point. One of my major memories from the time at the prep school was being summoned in the summer of 1976. I just turned 12, for the headmaster to tell me that my father was marrying my stepmother. And I was furious, you know. And I remember I went crimson, and I said to the headmaster, who I was terrified of, you had to remember that.
I do.
I said, I can't believe he hasn't got the courage to tell me himself. And then the headmaster gave me a sort of patronizing, well, you know, you're very young and men have needs and you won't understand. And I was just thinking, what the hell, you know? We couldn't have made it clearer to my father that my stepmother was really not negotiable for us. I know, of course, children shouldn't be able to, but we knew she was bad. And the fact that my father didn't have the manhood to tell his children personally was so disappointing because, well, it was his duty to do so.
Yeah. I felt when I've seen you together, and maybe this isn't quite as I've seen it, is that but because you had neglect, you'd be on a risk register, you know, if you weren't living in a palace sort of thing, that you siblings formed a particular bond where you protected each other. Like Diana wanted to come and see you at school.
Yeah.
But when I've seen you together or know you together, it does feel like you've tried your best between you all, I mean, amongst difficulties and normal family things, to parent each other in a way.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It was interesting because I hadn't even told. My two older sisters are quite a lot older than me. I mean, Sarah's nearly a decade older than me, and Jane's more than 7 years older. So, and then there was a brother who died as a baby, and
John.
then there was Diana and me. So
I linked that to Peter, by the way.
Oh yes, we grew up 2 and 2. So my two older sisters, I hadn't told them anything about this until a year and a half ago or something, and they were stunned. And
so upset. They must have been so upset for you.
They were very, very unhappy, and sort of. I mean, we are quite. As a unit, we thrive on humour, and it was very
black humour.
Very black humour. It was very hard to find even black humour in that situation. Sarah said, "Well, you were redheaded and a bit chubby," so she was trying to downplay the fact that I might be attractive to a paedophile. But the fact is, there's no accounting for why a paedophile does something. In fact, that was an interesting part of this process. Was I think for decades I was trying to work out why she did it, you know. But the point is, that's not my burden. I don't need to know why she did it. That's her problem. That's her issue. That's her crime. And for me, I just, I get on with it. I think
Have you thought of prosecuting?
When these issues first arose a decade or so ago, there was a famous lawyer who was heading the cases, and I wrote to her. And I didn't want to initiate a case, but I said, if somebody comes forward, I'll validate. And in fact, I never heard from her, so I assume nobody did. Part of the problem here is you're dealing with a school with a very clever culture. The outward sign was that it was a very Christian school, and the appalling headmaster led the services, and not the Sunday ones, but he was in charge of prayers and Christianity for us.
And he had this sort of wry humour that made parents think that he was one of them and they could trust him.
Very clever. I'm sure it's a common trick with people like that, abusers. But for an intensely unfunny man, he managed to turn on a rich vein of adult humour during his terminally reports to the parents. And time again, there are not many parents left actually, because obviously they'd be quite an age. But when I have confronted the parents in a thoughtful way, not in an angry way, about how come they let their children suffer this, not mine because they were dead, they all said, but he wrote such jolly amusing reports. And that was so clever, because how could such a very funny man be bad? But he was.
He was evil.
He did evil. He did evil. I don't know.
Is there something different between was
well,
and did?
I think he certainly did evil acts. I don't know if he's inherently evil because he did them.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not here on a moral point, I suppose. But he was a seriously deranged man, I'd say, apart from anything else.
But also there is, the transgenerational trauma in the upper classes of this sort of contract of this is how we do things. This is how we've always done them. We don't question them. We just sort of follow by the book. We send our young boys away at 6, 7, 8. We live like this. These are the rules. And it enables this kind of rigidity of it, enables parents to in some way take no responsibility for the decisions that they're making. It's like it's handed over to the system, which is a transgenerationally traumatic system of abandonment.
Yeah, because I write history books, actually. I really delved into the history of this. I found it so interesting.
It's to do with the empire, no?
Yes. But essentially, I found documentation in my family records going back 300 years where the older generation are sending their boys off, aged 8 or whatever, to school, boarding school, and they're writing to each other, the adults, saying, of course it's going to be horrendous, but at least they're too young to know how awful it's going to be. So they know what they're doing. It's a conscious cauterizing of emotions. And yes, you're right. I think it is to do with the empire. I think the idea would be that if you could cauterize the emotions of a young boy very early, you could send him anywhere in the world to administer on behalf of London. And he wouldn't be homesick. He wouldn't have normal emotions. He would have the stiff upper lip, which the English are famous for. But sadly, that comes at a hell of a price.
Yeah. I mean, what you shut down everything. You doesn't, if you shut down your capacity to feel pain and sorrow, it also shuts down your capacity to feel love, openness, trust. So you live in a very narrow window of emotional capacity. So you see the world in a very kind of robotic way, which works functionally,
yes,
but is devastating psychologically.
Yes, and I'm very aware about myself, actually. I know that there's a part of me that died at that school. Just factually, I have no pity, it's just what happened. And I actually
It got killed at that school.
But I actually weirdly have reconnected now. So my mother used to call me Buzz as a nickname when I was a very small child because I was quite full of action and naughtiness and all that. But that was really ripped out of me at Madewell.
Joy. You said you were full of joy.
Yeah. And I dedicate the book to Buzz because that's the person who was bumped off by that school. But weirdly, actually, I have to say I've done an enormous amount of work on myself. I'm in the middle of EMDR, which is very helpful, and I've breathing exercises and all sorts of things. I do Tai Chi, and I'm finding many ways of tapping into the remnants of Buzz.
That's a wonderful thing to kind of reconnect to, because trauma as you experienced it, and most child abuse, sexual, physical, psychological, isn't one instant. It's mostly over a long time, and it's always worse if it's meant to be with people that you trust. And one of the protective factors is if your mother protects you. So you were not protected.
That wasn't going to happen.
No, that was not happening. And I think recovery from trauma involves rediscovering exactly what you're kind of talking about, which is that when you've learned that human beings can do inhumane acts, all human beings are a threat and a danger. And so the recovery is, first of all, the disclosure, because the secret keeps it toxic and shame-filled. And in the disclosure, when you, as you did with your narrative, which must have been agony, you had migraines, you begin to tell yourself a story that was sort of inchoate in your system. And it feels a bit like that when you do that, you can begin to reconnect with safety, with respect, with dignity, and some trust. And I wondered how that is. I mean, today is a huge day with the book out. How you feel about that sort of right now?
It's been, well, I can, a lot of that resonates very deeply with me. I mean, first of all, I've always been, because of what happened, because I saw human nature at
It's absolute worst.
Pretty much its worst. Yeah. I've always been really interested in history, in the grisly bits, because it doesn't surprise me that people can do those things to each other. To the extent my friends all sort of roll their eyes when I yet again delve in some appalling story about what X did to Y back in the day. Then there's the sort of the more general point would be that I think that you have to come to terms with the past, and it's very hard to when it's bottled up in a sort of little, I suppose, like an oubliette, a sort of prison you put people in to forget. And it's been very interesting to hear from people who were my contemporaries, who, when I started to look into this book, they'd say, oh my God, I haven't even looked at Madewell for 50 years. I spoke to one person, I bumped into him, I hadn't seen him for ages. He was a lot older than me, and he was one of the few really nice boys there who was older and cared about the younger ones. And I talked to him about it. And he was sent away by his parents. They did it on purpose, he said, 300 miles, so they wouldn't have to see him. He never went home for the very occasional weekends we had out or half term. He was made to stay with one of the most perverted masters who liked to have the boys, of course. And I said, well, what did your parents say afterwards? And he said, no, it's a subject we weren't allowed to raise. And the one time during the 30 years after he left Madewell and his parents were still alive that it came up was his mother complained to his wife that she once had to look for an expert on bedwetting in London to come and tell him off at the school.
Oh, God.
And one time he was told by the headmaster, actually, you know, your parents are coming to take you out today. And he was so excited. And in fact, they sent their chauffeur instead, who drove him from Northamptonshire to Leicester Square and sat with him while he watched a movie and then took him back.
The brutality of it, you wonder why someone would have a child.
I suppose, I don't know that,
No.
but I think a lot of people had children because that was expected.
Yeah.
And then he said to me, they were...
Parenting actually as a 9, is it? Or only came into kind of use in the 60s?
Yes, I should say, I can see why.
And Winnicott in the sort of 50s, child development.
Mm. And I did actually study, I think it must be connected. We were allowed to do an optional subject at Eton. And I did do child psychology, actually. And I think that was my first attempt to try and make sense of stuff that had happened.
So now that you have let yourself know the full horror of the story that has been kind of silently poisoning you since you were 8 and all your adult life and has thrown you into all sorts of situations which probably if you hadn't had this experience, you would have avoided. Can you kind of look back and begin to, I don't know, come to terms with the things that you've done? Or because I imagine, you know, anger is an expression of hurt. It's like, oh, you're hurting me. So I imagine there's been quite a lot of hot anger through the years from the deep sense of hurt.
Yes, I
Does
think...
this help deal with that in some way?
Well, one of the legacies that I received was sort of flight or fight, whichever way it is.
Yeah, freeze.
Because that there was so much bruising inside, and I think I'm much, much less likely to do that anymore.
So you can regulate now?
I really am good at regulating. Look, I mean, I'm doing a form of Tai Chi. It's not what it's all of it's good Tai Chi, but it's not the very, very slow things you might associate with elderly Chinese. It's a bit more of a martial art, and I find it incredibly helpful philosophically and emotionally, and just in terms of all the balances, physical, mental. I found EMDR so good.
It's incredible, EMDR.
Each session has been
A specific
trauma.
memory.
Yeah, and some of the ones you've mentioned, actually. And you can sort of, not hit them on the head, but box them away.
You feel the distress come out of your body. It's amazing.
The first session I had of EMDR, of actual work, not the preliminaries, I was dealing with a very big trauma, which is one you touched on, which was being lied to that my mother was coming back. I remember the scene so well because I was very, very young. There had been an attempt after I was 2 for my mother possibly to come back, so I was probably 3. And the cheery, red-faced Norfolk housekeeper, Mrs. Petrie, a lovely lady, showed me a postcard and said, "Oh, this is from Mummy. She's in Australia." And I remember looking at it, and then she said, "She'll be back soon." And then the switch went off inside me. I knew she wasn't. I knew I was being lied to. I didn't know why. And I looked at that with EMDR. And, when every time I'd thought about that scene, it seared into my memory in very, very vivid colours, greens and reds and all sorts.
Gosh.
And then I did EMDR. And the next week, the specialist said, "So how did it go?" And I couldn't remember what we'd even discussed or dealt with. So she had to hint to me. And then after that, I thought about the memory. And instead of being this splash of violent colours, it was rather like the thin lines of an Etch-a-Sketch, that had just disappeared.
God, what a relief.
Yeah, so I'm knocking them off one by one. It's going to be rather a long course.
But have you, in the process of writing the book, being able to kind of reconnect with the children that you have, with your siblings, do you feel like it will open up, that in the healing in yourself will enable you to forge deeper, loving relationships with your own? You've got 7 children.
Yeah, I think so. I literally.
It's never too late, is what I'm saying.
This past weekend, I've just been with my elder son. It's his 30th birthday, and
gosh, 30.
Just hanging out with him and talking, and he's been so supportive through this. I mean, this has knocked me for 6, this process, and he's always been there, very thoughtful and careful.
Did they all read a first draft?
So that son read a first draft, and he had to stop. He said it was so upsetting, and he was having nightmares. And I
had nightmares.
Yeah, he once in the night punched his girlfriend during his sleep, and so he just said he couldn't. But I tell you what I did try and do. You very sweetly talked about the way it's written. I mean, I knew it was an ugly subject, so I wanted the book to not be in any way horrible. So I thought I wanted it to be a sort of Cider with Rosie type of lyrical. I can't change the subject matter, but I've tried to make it a lyrical piece rather than, and you won't believe this and you won't believe that. It's got to be smooth. And also what I've tried to do too is write it really in a way that a young boy would do it. So I suppose the takeaway headline would be me being sexually abused, but you sort of had to wait 15 chapters for that because it didn't happen till then in my time.
But also, if you're looking at someone across the table from you and saying to yourself, how come he became who he is? The sexual abuse is a particularly twisted, perverted horror that happened to you. But the tragedy started when you were 2. Of not being able to trust, of not having secure affection, not being told the truth, and then being sent to Madewell, when you were dreading it and no one listened to you. So, I mean, there's a long line of injury, serious, deep psychic injury that happened, of which Please was the really disgusting part of.
She was the most disgusting, but the terror of the place was the takeaway.
Terrible.
It was so
that's
scary.
That's what I felt, and that's what gave me nightmares.
Yes.
Because having no rules, the unpredictability, the thing about trauma is unpredictability. If you can see it coming and when it's coming, you can in some way brace yourself, and you have a kind of rule book. Madewell, because it was so random, and you could literally breathe, and that you'd be breathing wrong and you'd be punished and beaten.
Yes, no, there was no rule book. one of the most appalling things I found out in terms of just justice was a friend of mine was sent as a witness against another boy to be beaten, the nightly ritual at 10 to 6 for 6 or so boys to be beaten. And the boy lost bladder and bowel control. And the headmaster came out and screamed at him, sent him away to clean himself up, and then beat my friend who was just there as a witness because he had to have, it's like the Minotaur, you know, he had to have victims. And so that was when my friend said to me, when he was telling me this story, that was his eureka moment. That's when he knew it was evil, the setup. Yeah. But then I look at, you know, the whole point of this, writing this piece was when I listened to other people. I wrote down loads of notes about this school because I thought it would be good therapy, really. And then I spoke to people who went through unbelievable things, you know, rape, etc. And I was so shocked. I remember saying to one of them, this very sweet chap from a year below me told me, and I took 10 pages of notes, and I put the notebook down. I said, I just can't write this. Too much, yeah. And he just leant across. He's a very reserved Englishman. He just grabbed my arm across the fireplace, and he said, someone has to write our story. And that's why I decided to do it. And then equally, there are some who aren't here. I didn't put this in the book because I know the family very well. But one of my friends' brother had a terminal illness for a long time. And he left in his living will that his parents must not be allowed to visit him in what the doctors judged to be the last 2 weeks of his life, as a punishment not for sending him to Madewell, but for not taking him away when he was clearly in meltdown.
God. So horrific. But the injury goes so deep and so long.
Yes.
It's not something you get over. And I felt that you were writing for people who couldn't write for themselves, telling a story for them.
Well, you're right, Julia. So that was definitely the case. That's how I set off. But I had no idea how many of my close friends had been through similar, not just at Madewell. So I had a very close friend who I haven't seen for a while. He emigrated. And one of the reasons he emigrated was because he couldn't bear to live in a country that had allowed that level of abuse to occur to him. But I didn't know that until he got in touch with me. And in fact, 2 of them did that. One went to Scandinavia and one went to Australasia. And the one in Australasia I'd really lost contact with. And then his wife got in touch and said, you have no idea how pleased he is you're writing this.
Oh, good.
And he had been repeatedly raped in his school in their 70s and had never told anyone. And if you met him, he's the least likely, you know, he was big rugger.
Toughie.
Yeah. And he's lived with this secret and huge mental problems, you know. And he's the first person I sent a coffee to, actually.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Yeah, you look proud.
I'm very proud. Yeah. Very proud of that.
So what do you hope for the book now that it's out?
Well, if I want to qualify this, I really do want lots of people to read it, not for a commercial point of view, but because I really hope that the positive impact of this will resonate and reverberate a bit. It's just a book. Lots of people, I'm sure, well, I know several people who've written on similar
Alex
themes.
Renton.
Yeah. And so I'm not pretending that I'm a trailblazer here. But that old cliche, if it can help one person, well, I know it's already helped more than one. If it can help lots of people, how lovely. I mean, you've touched on it, and I wrote about it in the book. It was a horrible book to write. There were days, I'm quite an efficient writer. I've written lots of books, but normally I can do my 1,000 words a day and edit them and all that. But there were times when I looked at the screen and the screen looked back at me, and I thought, I'm never going to finish this, you know. Normally a book takes me 3 years, and this took 4.5. And that's because it was just so agonizing to write. And what was particularly triggering for me was I would go and have lunch with someone and talk to them who'd been there. The agony was hearing their stuff, actually, because there is this awful guilt. I didn't know they were suffering like that, you know. And I was quite tough at the school. I was
You were
quite
tough,
I was
yeah.
quite a senior person in
Yeah.
sport and academics
And you
and
were
all
shoved up about 5 classes ahead of your age and all of that.
all of that. So it's not like I was just sort of sitting in the corner. And I was trying to help back then some of the boys, and some of them have written very kindly about that.
And you stood up against the history master.
Yeah, he's still
That's
alive.
a good story.
He's still alive. He's going to get a copy through his letterbox.
I hope that really makes him very unhappy.
What a violent man. And actually, that's another thing you touched on earlier, the social background. I mean, I went to this school with a lot of household names there. And, but this particular master took against me personally, and I didn't know why. But he was a very, very earnest Marxist. And I suppose I was an obvious target. And he used to really hurt me, He
beat you on the back of your leg for no reason.
Yeah, but also he had this chunky signet ring. And I used to have bright red hair. And he used to do this thing. He could hit me. I mean, he's hitting everyone. But he used to hit me and then gouge my scalp and cut it. And it would just bleed and crust at the bottom. And it was, I remember growing up, I was thinking, I'm 10, you're 38. When I'm 38, I'm going to come and redress the balance. Well, I never did that. But the point is that you had to live on a hope that you could put things right. And I suppose, in a way, my book's an attempt to put things right now.
Yeah, it is a fight back in a way. When you were powerless then, you're not, in writing the book, you're not powerless.
No, it's not a vengeful piece, but it is a statement of truth that I would stand by, and I'm glad that others are rallying around.
What do you hope it might do for you personally, in relation to yourself and to your family? How might it change you?
It's made me a much gentler person. Not during the writing. That was pretty. I don't think I was much fun to be around because it was so intense, and I was having endless nightmares and all of that. And but I've come out so much calmer in the last, I'd say, 2 or 3 months. I've suddenly noticed this huge change. I used to drink too much. I haven't touched a drop since January, just because I don't want it. And
you're not looking for an anaesthetic against the rage.
Well, that's what it was, of course. It was an anaesthetic. And I see so many of these damaged private school men drinking a lot, and I can see why. And I don't need that anaesthetic. It's very nice to be clear-headed and pretty well, feeling mentally fit, and having put this to bed, really.
How do you feel about kind of love and trusting now, having had such a misshapen start?
Well, I was definitely looking for the wrong things. I was very promiscuous and very unhappy in my love life. There's been, you touched on it, you nailed it earlier actually. I didn't feel I deserved love. I had a great love in my early 20s. And I ran from her because it was just too threatening and
She'd
weird.
find out.
Yeah. So I destroyed it. And that's the biggest regret of my life. And I've talked to her more recently about that.
That's good.
And apologised. And she understands. I actually wrote to her mother at the time.
Did you?
When it ended, because she wrote me a very sweet letter. And I said, I'm just not worthy of her. I wrote that at the time.
That's heartbreaking, isn't it, that young man?
Well, it was easier to be with people that didn't matter. Familiar, sort of. I love my mother, but, she was not really capable. And as you touched on quite rightly, who knows what shaped her. But she wasn't really cut out for motherhood. So to try and, I think I went for good-looking people who weren't really into love.
And now?
Well, it's all, I'm having a good look at myself and everything around me, and I think it's a very healthy state to be in, to be honest. And I think I'd be a lot easier to live with now than I ever have been in the past. Because it was you are possessed by the guilt, the shame, and the pain, and I'm not anymore.
And that overrides every other feeling. So you're just, it's not available to you. You can't look at another person and feel love because we're wired evolutionary for those to take over, to protect us.
Yes.
And it was like you were in a state of constant vigilance and threat, which switches off your capacity to feel love, to receive it or to give it, because love isn't necessary when you're, at war. And you were at war for most of your life.
Yes, I remember actually, you've just reminded me, when I was very young, I'm talking sort of 19 to 25, I remember thinking, I must get married, because I thought somehow marriage would give me the balm that would make all this pain go away. So I'd start
Make you safe.
dating these girls, and I'd instantly be thinking of children's names and things. Very immature, damaged state to be in, and very dangerous.
But a natural one looking for safety. Right? Where can I find a place where I belong,
Yes.
where I'm lovable, where I can love and I can be myself? And that wasn't available to you until you did the Hoffman and then all of this work.
Yeah. I think a point I would like to make, and I make it in the book, when we're looking at this sexual abuse, I was 11, and a lot of, men, since when they hear of the headline that I was sexually abused as a child, they go, "Ooh, lucky you, because it's a woman." And I have to make the point, you know what? That's totally wrong. Imagine it was a 20-year-old man and an 11-year-old girl. And then they go, "Oh." But that sort of macho, absurd, private school sort of laddishness. It's just so
ignorance.
Disappointing.
It's it's like inherited from our parents, that type of ignorance.
Yes, totally.
So I kind of feel like we're coming to the end.
Mm-hmm.
For people who are listening, who both actually who may not have had any experience like this, what do you want them to know?
I think it's, if I don't sound too pompous, I think it would be look after your children, I was supposedly in the most privileged environment. A friend of mine, actually, who's not from the same background as me, when he found out this book was coming out, he said, "But I thought you would be protected." And I imagine my parents did too. But it was very easy for parents, particularly in those days, 50 years ago, to subcontract the boring business of childhood, as they'd have seen it, to amateurs. And they were unregulated amateurs who had dark
Who attracted
secrets.
particularly dark types of people, right?
Prep schoolmasters, yeah. Look, there's a lot of good people who work in the scouting movement or whatever, but where there are a lot of vulnerable children, you're going to attract people with very dangerous tendencies as well. So I would say, I have an 11-year-old, I have many children, and my youngest one I do the school run with in the morning, and it's a hoot. She's really funny and fun. And but she's quite bored of me asking, "Are there any strange teachers at school?" She sort of rolls her eyes and says, "Oh, for goodness sake, we've been through this." But I will always be on guard. There's many other areas where I'll fail, but I've always been very on guard with that stuff. And I didn't send any of my children to boarding school until they asked to go. I had two who wanted to go at age 14, the other one at 15. I would never send a child to boarding school aged 8, even if they think they want to go because they like Harry Potter.
Doing.
Yes, it's really very odd thing to do, and it shatters families. You mentioned I grew up with Diana, but when I was 7, she went off to boarding school, and that was so shattering. And also in those days, private schools didn't coordinate half terms and weekends, so there might be 13 weeks where I didn't see her, and that's the person I grew up with. I had a split childhood because of my parents. The one constant was the sister who was sent away to boarding school.
And she was taken away too.
Yeah.
What do you think she'd say about the book?
I think she'd be really pleased, actually. I think she'd be very happy that I've come out the other end a hell of a lot better than I went into it.
I think she'd be really proud of you.
Thank you.
She'd have been horrified that she didn't know.
People said, "Why didn't you tell?" But you just don't know. And also, I was so thrilled to be home, and she was. We never talked about school. It just wasn't interesting. It was getting back with the pets and the life we had been ripped away from,
Yeah, because you wanted to kind of
normalize it.
Build a wall between the horror of where it was.
Well, that's so interesting because it was so horrific. I used to every end of holidays, there was a dreaded countdown, days and hours, and I'd go and say goodbye to the pets, say goodbye to each room, that sort of thing. But I remember this thing became an obsession. Thank God I didn't do it, where I used to genuinely, strongly consider shooting myself with my father's shotgun in my foot to stop me having to go back. And I remember I was once watching TV, and it was MASH, and this soldier was found guilty of having given himself a self-inflicted wound. And I thought, well, I know why he did it. Yeah. To get away from the front.
And you two together, I mean, she must have hated boarding school too.
Yeah, it was a gentler version.
She wasn't.
It was a very old-fashioned place with pets and sewing and swimming. And I mean, it wasn't, I think they were happier, actually. I'm not saying, sorry, I'm only talking about her school. It was awful for her being away from home, but it was a gentler and kinder environment with a nice headmistress.
And I imagine the two of you, because I've also seen you, the sisters together, is that kind of black humour and a lot of laughter and a lot of teasing.
Yes.
And a lot of play.
Yeah, a lot of that. That was really the basis of the relationship. It's a lot of dark humour, which of course.
And a wonderful laugh.
Yeah, totally.
We both miss her.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, thank you. I think you've been very thorough and good. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Julia.
A quick note to say there was a very quick turnaround between this incredibly moving conversation with Charles Spencer and the release on Wednesday morning. And just to let you know that the mother-daughter segment is going to be released on Friday morning.